What if I told you the men who built America weren't just fighting for freedom? They were also fighting over their favorite meals. Behind every late-night debate, every handwritten letter that changed the world, every victory toast, there was a dish that kept these founding fathers going. Some of those foods were comforting and simple, the kind of thing your grandma might still make today. Others were fancy enough to shock foreign guests. And a few? Let's just say, if I showed you a picture of them right now, you might question every history lesson you've ever heard. These hidden foods never made it into the textbooks, but they fed the men who shaped our nation. And it all starts with Benjamin Franklin, a man who believed the flavor of America could be found in one very surprising dish. Benjamin Franklin. Before he became the most electric man in American history, Benjamin Franklin was just a curious kid from Boston who loved to eat. He worked his way up from a simple printer's shop all the way to negotiating peace in Paris. He invented the lightning rod, helped shape the Declaration of Independence, and basically figured out how to mail a letter across the entire country. But underneath all that genius, Ben Franklin was a man powered by poultry. His absolute favorite? A beautifully roasted turkey. Not just any turkey, Franklin wanted his birds big, juicy, and cooked to absolute perfection. To him, the turkey was the true American hero of the dinner table. He even wrote letters praising its good looks and noble attitude, while calling the bald eagle a bird of bad moral character. Only Franklin could start a fight between two birds over patriotism. And then there's the legendary turkey incident. Franklin once tried to cook a turkey using electricity, because why not? He wanted to create the world's first electric Thanksgiving, but instead of zapping dinner, he shocked himself. Hard. Guests said the turkey tasted great, though Franklin spent most of supper wondering if he still had a pulse. That's dedication, or hunger. Maybe both. Plus, Franklin didn't just eat turkey. He studied it. He described its feathers, its walk, even its posture, like a proud restaurant critic reviewing a national treasure. When he traveled, he talked about turkey. When he wrote letters, he mentioned turkey. Historians say if Franklin had a pet turkey following him around Congress, people would have believed it. And let's be honest, the turkey deserves some credit. When Franklin stood up for independence, that roasted bird was right there cheering him on, in spirit. Ben liked to say that a good dinner solved more problems than a long argument. And when the Revolutionary War was stressing him out, a plate of roasted turkey reminded him exactly what they were fighting for: home, comfort, and the right to choose your favorite meat without a king telling you otherwise. So, yes, Franklin wanted the turkey on America's flag, not because it looked good, but because it tasted like victory. But as much as Franklin loved his patriotic poultry, another founding father took comfort food to a whole new level, a level so humble that folks joked he could finish a plate faster than he could lead an army. George Washington. George Washington is known as the father of his country, having served as commander-in-chief during the Revolution, president of the Constitutional Convention, and the first U.S. president. But before he became a legend, George Washington was a tall, quiet Virginian who preferred the smell of earth and smoke to politics. He rose before dawn at Mount Vernon, walking through the fields as mist rolled off the Potomac, his boots damp with dew. And before facing any battle, whether in war or in government, he started his morning the same way, with a plate of simple, homemade cornmeal cakes, hot off the griddle. It wasn't fancy food. It was the kind of breakfast a farmer could afford, made from ingredients grown right on his land. Washington's cook would mix cornmeal, water, and a little butter, frying them on a cast-iron pan until crisp on the edges and soft in the middle. He'd top them with a drizzle of honey or syrup, not out of luxury, but out of habit. It was a reminder that even a president is still a man with humble tastes. On campaign, when the war turned cold and supplies ran thin, Washington shared those same cakes with his soldiers. He'd sit by the fire, steam rising from tin plates, and for a brief moment the army was just a group of hungry men sharing warmth and silence. The general didn't say much, but that simple act of breaking bread, or in this case, breaking cake, earned a loyalty no speech could buy. After victory and the presidency, Washington never changed. Ambassadors from Europe would arrive at the White House expecting grand banquets and imported delicacies. Instead, they'd find the leader of the free world smiling over a humble breakfast that smelled like home. Martha Washington herself made sure the griddle was always ready. That meal grounded him, reminding him of where he came from and what America was supposed to be: honest, steady, and built from the land. They say character is what you do when no one's watching. For Washington, it was getting up early, pouring batter, and thanking the cook before stepping into history. In a world obsessed with power and image, he stayed true to something simpler: a quiet breakfast that fed both body and spirit. And while Washington found peace in his morning ritual, the next patriot's favorite meal was anything but calm. It was hot, portable, and perfect for a midnight ride. Paul Revere. While his midnight ride is legendary, Paul Revere is known for helping to ignite the American Revolution by warning patriots of the advancing British military. But before galloping and the lanterns, he was a silversmith, a father of 16, and a man who knew how to eat on the run. In his tiny Boston kitchen, he kept things simple: hearty, portable food that could travel as fast as he did. When midnight rides and secret meetings filled his schedule, he didn't have time for fancy suppers. He needed something he could wrap in cloth, tuck into a saddlebag, and eat one-handed under the moonlight. That's where his favorite meal came in, the kind of hot, flaky meat pie every colonial household knew how to make. Filled with bits of beef, potato, onion, and a touch of gravy, it was the fast food of the Revolution. Apprentices carried them to the forge, mothers packed them for long trips, and Paul carried them into history. He'd grab one fresh from the hearth, take a bite while strapping on his boots, and ride into the night, crumbs on his coat, courage in his chest. Neighbors swore you could smell those savory pies long after he'd disappeared down the cobblestone streets. Some even said the British never caught him because they were distracted by the scent. It's a funny thought that the alarm for liberty might have started with the smell of dinner. Revere's food wasn't about luxury, it was about motion. It kept him steady through freezing winds and long hours, a reminder that even heroes need fuel. When he wasn't warning towns or hammering silver, he'd sit by the fire with his family, sharing a fresh batch and laughing about near misses and wild rides. Those moments, simple, loud, and full of warmth, were his real reward. Maybe that's what made him different. While others chased glory, Revere chased purpose. And sometimes just a hot meal that didn't fall apart at full gallop. He never knew his name would echo through classrooms centuries later. He just knew a man can't save a nation on an empty stomach. And while Revere found his strength in speed and spice, the next patriot found comfort in something slower: a slow-boiled feast that reminded him of New England's heart and home. John Adams. John Adams was the kind of man who believed in order, hard work, and a hot meal at the end of the day. Before he became America's second president, he was a lawyer, a farmer, and a stubborn New Englander who didn't mind speaking his mind or his appetite. Life in Massachusetts wasn't easy in the 1700s, but Adams found comfort in a meal that defined the region: the New England boiled dinner. Picture this: a big iron pot bubbling all afternoon, filled with corned beef, cabbage, carrots, potatoes, and turnips. It wasn't glamorous, but it smelled like home. To Adams, that pot of slow-simmering goodness meant family and routine, two things that kept him steady while politics grew wild around him. He'd write letters about the future of the Republic with one hand and tear off a piece of boiled beef with the other. When Adams traveled to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, he wrote to Abigail about missing those suppers back home, the simple, honest flavors that spoke to their shared New England roots. While others craved imported wine or rare delicacies, he dreamed of cabbage and salt beef, cooked until tender enough to fall apart with a spoon. Abigail often replied that she kept the pot boiling, waiting for his return, a quiet symbol of the life they were building for everyone. Even as president, Adams kept his Yankee table modest. He invited ministers and diplomats to the White House and served them humble fare, explaining that the nation's strength came not from its luxury, but its simplicity. Some guests were puzzled, others left inspired. For Adams, the boiled dinner wasn't just food, it was philosophy, a recipe for independence itself. Hard work, patience, heat, and a pinch of salt to remind you where you came from. In a way, that pot was a reflection of Adams himself. Tough ingredients made tender by time and pressure. He didn't always win popularity contests, but like his favorite dinner, he left everyone a little warmer, a little fuller, and a lot more grounded. And while Adams's dinners were slow and steady, the next patriot's tastes were wilder, roasted in smoke, hunted by hand, and born straight out of the back country. Patrick Henry. The firebrand of the Revolution, Patrick Henry earned his place as a founding father by using his legendary voice to turn a quiet room into a battlefield. His impassioned speeches, including his famous cry of "Give me liberty or give me death," were crucial for rallying colonial support and mobilizing the Virginia militia for war. Before this, he was a young Virginia lawyer, scraping by on debate fees, farm chores, and a diet that was anything but refined. Henry grew up on the edge of the frontier, where food was simple, smoky, and hard-earned, the kind of meal that came from what you hunted, not what you bought. In his kitchen, the smell of open fire and iron pans was constant. Hunters brought in venison, and Henry learned to roast it the old way, skewered over hot coals until the fat sizzled and the smoke curled through the rafters. That flavor, wild, charred, primal, was the taste of the Virginia backcountry. For Henry, it wasn't just dinner. It was proof that freedom meant feeding yourself from your own land. Friends often said Patrick's temper burned as hot as his hearth. He'd host neighbors, arguing politics while carving thin strips of meat right off the bone, his hands still stained with smoke. "Talk is good," he'd say, "but a man should eat while he talks." It became a sort of ritual, debate, roast, repeat, until the whole room smelled like wood fire and revolution. Even as he rose to fame, Henry never developed a taste for the European luxuries his peers admired. While others sipped imported wine, Patrick was still cooking over campfire flames. He saw elegance in survival, in the honest, unpolished meals that reminded him what liberty tasted like. And that's the irony of it all. The man whose words lit the spark of independence kept his life, and his dinner, humble. Because when you think about it, Patrick Henry's fiery speeches and smoky suppers came from the same place, a hunger that no king could ever satisfy. And speaking of men who blended politics and appetite, the next patriot had a signature meal that filled stomachs from taverns to the halls of Congress, a dish so hearty it became the unofficial comfort food of the Revolution. John Hancock. Before his name became the boldest signature on the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock was a Boston merchant who lived large, in personality and appetite. He wasn't just a patriot, he was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, known for his fine clothes, elegant parties, and dinners that turned political talk into action. But even with all his wealth, Hancock's heart, and stomach, stayed true to New England. His favorite meal brought together the tastes of his seafaring city, salted cod and baked beans. Cod was Boston's lifeblood, caught by local fishermen, dried, salted, and shipped across the Atlantic. Baked beans, meanwhile, were the heartbeat of every Saturday night supper. Together, they made a dish that smelled of the harbor, of work, and of home. Hancock's cooks would soak the beans overnight, mix them with molasses and pork, then bake them slowly in a brick oven until the scent filled the house. When guests arrived, they'd be greeted by the aroma of salt, sweet, and smoke, a meal fit for merchants and revolutionaries alike. Even the servants would sneak a spoonful before it hit the table. There's a story that during the early days of rebellion, Hancock invited Samuel Adams and other patriots to his home for what was supposed to be a secret meeting. The talk turned tense. Taxes, boycotts, British ships in the harbor, until Hancock told the cook to serve dinner. The salted cod and beans came steaming to the table, and suddenly the room softened. Between bites and laughter, the men planned their next steps toward independence. The revolution, it turned out, might have started over dinner, and though Hancock could afford imported delicacies, he never abandoned those humble local flavors. They reminded him that every great cause starts small: a handful of ingredients, a few good men, a table full of purpose. When he lifted his quill to sign his name larger than anyone else's, maybe he was thinking of those dinners, of how something ordinary, shared in unity, could spark something extraordinary. And while Hancock's story was salted by the sea, the next founding father had sweeter tastes and a flair for the elegant European kind of indulgence. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson might have been the most curious eater among the founding fathers. Long before farm to table was a trend, he was living it at Monticello, growing his own vegetables, harvesting herbs from terraced gardens, and trading seeds with friends across the Atlantic. He saw food not just as nourishment, but as a way to connect nations. After all, this was the man who penned the Declaration of Independence, then went to France and fell in love with cuisine. While serving as ambassador in Paris, Jefferson kept notebooks filled with sketches of kitchen tools and recipes for sauces, pastries, and frozen desserts. One recipe in particular captured his imagination: a cold, creamy delight served only to European royalty. Jefferson was fascinated. He studied it, wrote down instructions, and even shipped the molds, salt, and sugar back home so he could recreate it in Virginia. When he finally served it at Monticello, guests were stunned. They'd never seen anything like it in the New World. He was the first American known to serve ice cream regularly at formal dinners. It wasn't the kind we know today. His was richer, almost custard-like, flavored with real vanilla beans imported from France. To keep it frozen, enslaved workers labored around barrels of salt and ice in the heat of summer. It was a show of elegance and innovation, and a quiet glimpse into the contradictions of a man who dreamed of liberty but lived in a world built on inequality. Still, for Jefferson, food was philosophy. He believed a good meal could teach people to live well, not through excess, but through curiosity and care. His table was filled with olives, macaroni, garden produce, and that famous ice cream, all served alongside conversations about science, art, and democracy. To dine with Jefferson was to taste the Enlightenment itself, and when the last spoonful melted, he'd smile and tell guests that the true joy of freedom wasn't in grand speeches. It was in small, shared pleasures. But not all of America's early leaders chased refinement. The next patriot found satisfaction not in fancy feasts, but in the humble bounty of his own orchard, a man whose meals were as simple, crisp, and honest as his words: John Jay. Before he became America's first Chief Justice, John Jay was a man of the soil as much as of the law. He grew up in the rolling countryside of New York, where the air smelled of hay and apples instead of gunpowder and ink. Even as he helped craft the Constitution and shape the Supreme Court, Jay always longed for the rhythm of farm life: sunrise chores, the creak of barn doors, and the reward of a warm supper earned through honest work. Unlike Jefferson's polished banquets or Hancock's grand gatherings, Jay's table was modest, filled with food he raised or bartered for himself. His favorite kind of evening meal was the kind that reminded him of home: rustic suppers built around apples, root vegetables, and simple roasted meats. When the weather turned cold, his wife Sarah would bake apples stuffed with nuts and brown sugar, their skins bursting in the hearth's heat, the smell drifting through the house like a memory of fall. It wasn't luxury, it was comfort. Visitors to the Jay homestead often wrote about his hospitality. He insisted that guests eat like family, not like dignitaries. Plates were filled with roasted chicken, potatoes, and the apples his orchards were famous for. In those quiet dinners, politics faded. Jay would talk about harvests, about faith, about keeping life simple when the world grew loud. "There is more honesty in a plow than in a parliament," he once joked, and everyone laughed, because they knew he meant it. Even in retirement, Jay worked the land with his own hands, He planted new trees, harvested the fruit, and pressed cider each autumn. He said a good apple crop felt more rewarding than any legal victory. Maybe that's why his meals always tasted like patience, each bite seasoned with time and gratitude. And when he finally sat down at the end of a long day, the great statesman looked less like a founding father and more like any American farmer, content with the work of his hands and the food of his fields. But not every patriot found peace in orchards and hearth fires. The next man's appetite leaned toward the hearty and the smoky, a Southern classic that tasted like home and power all at once. James Madison. James Madison was small in stature but mighty in mind, the father of the Constitution, a thinker who preferred quiet study to loud politics. Yet even this scholarly Virginian had his own simple comforts, and they came straight from the smokehouse. Madison's table wasn't known for luxury or excess. It reflected his life's philosophy, deliberate, balanced, and deeply rooted in Virginia soil. On his Montpelier estate, the scent of curing hams was as familiar as the rustle of parchment in his study. Madison loved the way the smoke curled up from the brick house behind the kitchen, a smell that meant home, tradition, and time well spent. Each autumn, his workers salted and hung the hams to dry, then slowly smoked them for weeks until the meat turned deep red and rich with flavor. When sliced thin and served with corn cakes or greens, it was food that tasted like history, earthy, enduring, undeniably American. For Madison, it wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual. He'd host dinners for guests and political allies, but his attention often wandered back to that same familiar flavor from his boyhood. His wife, Dolly Madison, the nation's first true hostess, made sure it was always on the table, whether they were serving senators or farmers. Dolly's charm and his calm intellect balanced each other perfectly. She brought the warmth, he brought the wisdom, and the ham brought everyone together. One story goes that during the War of 1812, when the British burned Washington, Dolly refused to leave without saving George Washington's portrait. But what she packed next, after the national treasure, was a small box of cured meat from Montpelier. Even in crisis, the Madisons clung to their roots. It was as if the taste of home was their reminder that America could be rebuilt again. When Madison retired, he spent his mornings walking the fields, checking the smokehouse, and greeting neighbors with a slice of cured ham wrapped in paper. He said it aged like the Constitution itself, carefully, patiently, and only improving with time. But where Madison found comfort in the slow burn of Virginia smoke, the next patriot found joy in something brighter and sweeter, a taste baked in golden crusts and cinnamon from the ovens of a woman whose stitches once helped build a flag that would outlast them all. Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross is famously, though perhaps inaccurately, credited with sewing the first American flag after a visit from George Washington. When people picture Betsy Ross, they see her bent over a flag, needle in hand, the stars and stripes taking shape under candlelight. But away from her sewing table, Betsy was also a baker's daughter who never lost her love for the smell of a warm oven. In her Philadelphia kitchen, the same steady hands that stitched America's first flag rolled dough and sliced apples, turning simple ingredients into something that felt like home. Betsy's life was anything but easy. Widowed 3 times, she raised children, ran her upholstery shop, and quietly served the Revolution by mending uniforms and sewing flags for Continental troops. Money was tight, ingredients scarce, but she always found time to bake. Her neighbors remembered the comforting scent of butter and cinnamon drifting through Arch Street, a small reminder that hope could still be sweet, even in wartime. Her favorite dessert was a humble apple pie, crisp crust, tender fruit, and a dash of spice. Apples were plentiful around Pennsylvania, and Betsy believed no meal was complete without something baked fresh. When soldiers passed through the city, she'd share a slice if she could spare it. They said it tasted like a letter from home, flaky, warm, and gone too fast. Some even claimed that when she sewed the first flag, a pie was cooling on the sill beside her, the smell mingling with the scent of new cloth and courage. That was Betsy Ross in essence, practical, nurturing, quietly heroic. She didn't need speeches or medals. She believed in showing love through her work and through her food. Every crust she rolled was an act of endurance, every pie a symbol of the sweetness worth fighting for. So, when the revolution's storms raged outside her window, Betsy didn't lose faith. She baked, she stitched, she kept the home fires and the ovens burning. And in her own quiet way, she proved that sometimes the smallest comforts, a warm flag, a warm slice of pie, can hold a nation together. But while Betsy found her strength in sweetness, the next patriot's taste ran sharper. A man who came from the islands, fought for everything he had, and never forgot the bold, bright flavors of home. Alexander Hamilton. Before his face ended up on the $10 bill, Alexander Hamilton was the outsider of the Founding Fathers, the only one who didn't start life in the colonies. He grew up on the Caribbean island of Nevis, the orphan son of a struggling family, surrounded by salt air, sugarcane, and the bright sting of tropical fruit. The smells and flavors of that world never left him, even after he sailed north to make his name in the new republic. Hamilton's taste buds carried those islands with him. Whenever he could, he asked for salt-cured fish, brightened with citrus and herbs, a dish common among sailors and dockhands back home. It was cheap, filling, and packed with the flavors of lime, pepper, and sun. He'd joke that it tasted like honest work and sea wind. In New York, where he built his career, he often hunted for something similar at the markets by the harbor. The vendors called it West Indian style, and the moment he smelled that briny tang, he was transported. Friends said Hamilton ate with the same intensity he argued. At dinners with Washington or Madison, he'd season everything heavier than anyone else at the table. He liked sharp, vivid flavors, food that fought back, just like he did. Once, during a campaign dinner, a guest teased him for eating something so common. Hamilton laughed and replied, "Common food built uncommon men." That line stuck, and so did the respect that followed. His rise from poverty to power was as bold as the taste of his favorite meal. Salt fish and citrus were reminders of where he started, proof that you didn't need a family name to make history, just fire in your belly and faith in your own recipe for success. Even when politics turned against him, Hamilton's friends said he never lost that island edge, fast, fiery, and impossible to ignore. And though his story ended too soon on a dueling ground, you can almost imagine that final morning, the air sharp, the world quiet, the memory of salt and lime still clinging to his tongue. But while Hamilton's life burned bright with ambition and spice, the next patriot's story moved at a slower, softer rhythm. A Southern gentleman who found comfort in the warm, golden hush of spoon-bread fresh from the hearth. James Monroe. James Monroe came from Virginia soil like many of his peers, but unlike them, he never chased polish or spectacle. He was the last of the Founding Fathers to serve as president, a bridge between the fiery revolutionaries and the calmer generation that followed. Even when he stood before kings and diplomats in Europe, he carried the quiet humility of a farmer's son who preferred hearthlight to chandeliers. At home, Monroe's comfort lived in the kitchen. Spoonbread, the soft golden cousin of cornbread that rises high and melts like butter on the tongue. His wife, Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, was said to make it often at Oak Hill, their Virginia estate. It was simple: cornmeal, milk, eggs, and a touch of cream, whipped until airy, then baked until the top turned crisp and brown. They would eat it hot from the dish, the steam curling up through the window like morning fog over the fields. For Monroe, that dish was more than food, it was memory. He had fought through brutal winters with Washington's army, crossed rivers half-frozen, and learned that warmth could be a kind of salvation. Every spoonful of that soft bread was a reminder that peace, once won, had to be savored. He believed a strong nation should taste like home, humble, nourishing, and shared. When he became president, Monroe's table reflected the same spirit as his famous era of good feelings. He welcomed guests from across the country, offering them hearty Southern fare instead of European extravagance. The spoonbread often appeared beside ham, greens, and coffee, a taste of the land he loved, baked into every bite. It was his way of saying that America didn't need borrowed recipes, its own traditions were rich enough. As age crept in, Monroe retired quietly to his estate, his hands too worn for war, but still steady enough to lift a spoon. He'd watch the sunset across his fields, the same fields that had once seemed impossible to defend, and smile. The Revolution had become a republic, and its last founding father was finally home. A man content with simple victories and a plate of warm spoonbread. And that's the story the textbooks never told you, how America's first meals built America's first dream. From Franklin's electric turkey to Monroe's golden spoonbread, every bite carried something bigger than flavor. It carried faith, grit, and the comfort of home. When you think about it, the Revolution wasn't just fought with muskets or paper and ink. It was fed with simple food that kept hope alive through long nights and harder winters. Each plate, each loaf, each bite of something warm whispered the same truth. Freedom always starts at the table. So maybe, in your own kitchen tonight, when you stir a pot or break bread with family, you're keeping that same spirit alive, the taste of resilience, shared one meal at a time. If this story stirred your appetite for history, hit that subscribe button and join us here at The America We Remember, where old recipes never die and every bite tells a story worth savoring. Because our past didn't just feed the body, it fed the nation.